A few months ago, I got a postcard from a viewer who asked me to do a WxYz on the subject of prevailing winds. Now, I'd planned to do this back on Valentine's Day because there's a connection to roses. You'll see what I mean in a minute. But the big winter storm that day forced me to push it back a couple weeks. Well, let's start with a definition. The prevailing wind is the wind direction that's most frequently observed during a given time period. In some parts of the world, it's actually pretty clear-cut what the prevailing wind is. For example, high pressure is so common in the subtropical North Pacific Ocean that northeast winds dominate the Hawaiian Islands, those so-called trade winds. And that's true pretty much year-round at most places in Hawaii. Now, there's a neat diagram called a wind rose that we use to summarize the winds at a particular place. It's so named because the points of a compass sort of resemble the petals of a rose. Now, typically we use the 8 major wind directions, west, northwest, north, etc., and the 8 half winds, such as south-southeast and west-northwest. So that gives 16 possible directions. Then we draw narrow cones from the center outward in each direction, where the length of the cone is proportional to how frequently the wind blows from that direction. Now, this happens to be the wind rose for January in Honolulu, and notice the dominance of east-northeast and northeast winds. Now, at most mid-latitude locations, the prevailing wind is westerly. For example, here's Pittsburgh's wind rose for the whole year. Notice most of the cones are in the western half of the diagram, with west and west-southwest the most common directions. By the way, the colors here give information about the wind speed from the various directions. I won't worry about that particular aspect of the story today. Now let's hop across the state to Philadelphia, where the wind rose is similar to Pittsburgh's, dominated by winds ranging from southwest to northwest. One difference, check out that little spoke pointing in the east-northeast direction. That's the mark of nor'easters moving up the coast. If we look at the wind rose just for January in Philadelphia, there's that nor'easter signature, and notice the dominant wind direction is northwest and west-northwest. That's really true for much of the state from about November to March. Now let's take a look at July in Philadelphia. Notice the change. Southwest winds really take over then, and that holds pretty much for much of the state from about May to September. Now, I want to show one more wind rose, this one from the northeast, Scranton-Wilkes-Barre area, where the valley location really makes a difference. Now, this is for January. Notice there's a fair amount of northwest wind. The prevailing wind is southwest, but interestingly enough, there's not a lot of winds from due west and hardly any sign of the easterly winds that accompany those big coastal storms. Now, part of the issue here is the terrain. The Wyoming Valley runs from southwest to northeast, and the southwest end of the valley is fairly open. The terrain is pretty high just west of the observing site, so there's a tendency for west winds to be diverted around and funnel up the valley from the southwest. The northeast end of the valley is a lot more mountainous. That's really true all to the east of the Wyoming Valley, so winds with an easterly component tend to be blocked and thus not observed very much. Now, if you want to check out more wind roses from Pennsylvania, just go to the website of the Pennsylvania State Climatologist, who just happens to be our very own Paul Knight. Coming up next, though, I'll turn it over to Fred with the extended forecast.